meeting to order at 11:16 a.m. Terry is away for a couple of hours today, so I'll be taking over for her, and I would like to welcome everyone to our first council meeting for 2025. I would like to welcome our new council members, especially our new professional members, Carmen Adabar, Tiffany Murray, and Lisa Moore, who are starting their 3-year term. I'd like to welcome Glenn Pettifer, our registrar, Julie McCura, our legal counsel, the CDHO staff that are joining us, and to those of you watching on the live stream on YouTube. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we, council guests, staff, and those watching on YouTube each call home. So, agenda item 1.2, Code of Conduct. Council members shall conduct themselves in accordance with the bylaws. We have all read the bylaws, section 3.7. I will remind council members that we are to act in the best interests of the college and the public of Ontario, and as such, we should ensure that we keep this in the forefront of our minds in all of our discussions and while making all of our decisions. As housekeeping for our meeting, please ensure you speak loudly and clearly so those online are able to hear us, and please ensure you mute yourself when not talking and come off of mute when you are. Should a conflict of interest be declared for an agenda item, the council member will be placed in a breakout room for that agenda item. They will then be able to return to the main room once that discussion and vote has been completed. So we'll move to item 2.1, which is approval of the agenda. Does anyone have any items that they wish to add or anything to change? Not seeing any. So I have a motion that council moves to approve the January 17th, 2025 council meeting agenda as presented. Do I have a mover for that? Aaron, thank you. A seconder, Vanessa, thank you. All those in favor? Okay, good. Perfect. Item 3.1 relates to conflict, conflict of interest. Does anyone have any conflicts of interest to declare with any agenda items for today's meeting? Not seeing any. Good, we'll move to item 4.0, board education. At this time, I would like to invite Julie McCura to provide us with our council orientation for 2025. Julie has practiced administrative law with an emphasis on professional regulation for over 30 years. She acts as general counsel, prosecutor, and independent legal counsel for numerous Ontario regulators. Julie's general counsel work includes training specific to the needs of statutory committees, guidance to regulators on registration and quality assurance matters, as well as drafting regulations, bylaws, standards, and policies. Julie has also performed comprehensive legal audits of various statutory programs and processes for regulators and has experience with strategic planning. Julie has appeared in all levels of court in Ontario, representing the interests of regulators on appeals and judicial review applications. We look forward to your presentation, Julie.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and Happy New Year, everyone. Lovely to see everyone. Okay, so this is the most stressful part of my presentation, getting the slides up on the screen. So fingers crossed. Here we go. You should probably see some pink flowers first until I start to press another thing. Thumbs up, yes. I love it when that happens. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about roles and responsibilities today, but Terry asked that I sort of focus a bit more versus the one that you've likely heard me sort of do last year, where we did sort of a high-level overview of the RHPA. We're going to focus more on the role of counsel, operations, how you do your work when you are giving guidance to the profession, and of course, talk about your fiduciary duties. So feel free to ask questions at any time. I think if you use the little hand up emoji, that brings you up to the top of the list of folks, so I'll be able to see you. And we have a couple of scenarios for discussion later on, so I'm hoping that you're all going to participate as well. But feel free to ask questions at any time. You don't have to wait until the end. So just to ground us a little bit, of course, and Michelle already mentioned this in her opening remarks, but the public interest, of course, is at the forefront of what you do. That is not, however, defined in the Regulated Health Professions Act, which of course is the statute and that created the college, creates the college and gives you your legal authority. So it really depends on the particular circumstances, like what is the issue or initiative or project that we're dealing with. And it also depends on the perspective of who's looking at the issue. But you can get guidance about what the public interest is by looking at the enabling legislation, because that's what the government, the provincial government delegated to the CDHO the ability and the authority to govern the profession of dental hygiene. So you look at the Health Professions Procedural Code, which is Schedule 2 to the RHPA, and right in Section 3, it lists the things, the objects of the college, and that ends with, essentially, you do all of those things in the public interest. And we can also see from the code that there's an overriding, a very important aspect of the work that you do as well is, along with the other colleges, to try to eradicate the sexual abuse of patients. You can also look, because we live in a common law jurisdiction, you also look at court decisions about the public interest and also about duties of fairness that you owe to individual registrants or applicants. You can also get guidance from studies, commissions, inquiries. You know that you had Deanna Williams and Harry Caton do a governance review. They talk about the public interest as well. So there's all kinds of different studies and commissions that you can look at to see what the public interest really is. So these questions here are helpful to keep in mind when you're about to make a decision on council. Does it relate to our statutory objects? So you go back to the code and look and see what the objects of the college are. Does it further, or does it enhance or promote one of the 4 core regulatory activities? And those, of course, are the words here, like I describe them as restrictive, reactive, proactive, and transparent. And what that really means is the restrictive part is the entry to practice registration program of the college. Reactive is the complaints and discipline. Proactive is quality assurance. And then transparency is really about your website, your public registered public council meetings like this, public discipline hearings, the college's website where people can go on and find out information about what the college is doing and about its members. Is your work being done transparently? Who's the primary beneficiary? If it's going to be the profession, then the decision might not be one that's in the public interest. Would this better fit under, for example, the employer's mandate? Who's going to be unhappy with our decision? How would it look on the front of the Toronto Star? How would our accountability bodies like the courts, the Fairness Commissioner, the Health Professions Appeal and Review Board, how would they respond to this particular initiative that we're doing? So that's just a little bit of a reminder about the public interest, but when you think of that, these are the questions that you want to sort of keep in the back of your mind when you're going to make a decision about a project or an initiative that the college is doing. So let's talk a little bit about governance. What is governance? So just like public interest, you hear the word governance a lot. So it really is the sort of the system that an organization like the college decides on to make sure that the overall direction of the college, what is our overall direction, to make sure that it's effective and to make sure that you're accountable, to the system partners and to the public. So it really is something that it's a constant iterative process. You don't just do it in January and it's done for the year. It's a process that requires reflection and renewal, continual monitoring and improvements, and responding to the pressures from system partners and the expectations from entities like the government about what good governance looks like. So it's not a goal or an end in and of itself. What it really is a means to achieve your end. So if you have good governance in place, that's going to allow for consensus on important decisions that you have to make. It'll allow for a well thought out mission, goals, strategies. It will help you make sure that the activities that you're doing are focused and that they're actually having a positive effect. It will help you recruit and retain the best and brightest, both on council and on staff. Good governance will help you use your available talent well and to achieve the ends that are set out, of course, in the RHPA. So the philosophy, because you are a public interest body, really means that your activities are open to scrutiny. whether it's the public, whether it's the profession, whether it's your accountability bodies like the Fairness Commissioner, they can see what you do. And so good governance will help to prevent failures, regulatory failures. It's important to keep in mind that it's not the, especially for professional members on council, it's not the sort of legislative assembly model that once you are elected by, let's say, District 2 or District 12 or Southeast District, you do not represent those members who elected you. That's just a way to get geographical representation on council. Once you are on council, just like the public members on council, you represent the public interest. That's what you're looking, that your overriding object is the public. You do not represent the profession. The professional association is the entity that advocates for the profession. So part of the philosophy as well, and we can see that from the RHPA, is that the partnership with the registrar, because there are certain things under the RHPA and the code that only the registrar can do, such as appointing investigators, referring applications to the registration committee, those kinds of things. So it's unlike a regular corporation, if you will. There are certain things that only the registrar can do, but also your governance philosophy really means that in order to have good governance, council has to have a really strong relationship and partnership with the registrar. And generally, when we see failures across the country of regulatory bodies, it's where there's a lack of trust between the registrar and council. So ideally, your governance philosophy would be that it's about transparency, open dialogue, objectivity, respect, and forthright debate. Doesn't mean that you have to be in agreement before you make your decision and you vote at council, but you have to have a respectful dialogue as you are coming to your decision. So sort of a easy way to remember, to think about tools that will help you have good governance is to make sure that think about the 4 E's: the explanation of your role, education, evaluation, and enforcement. So in terms of explanation, you need to have a clear written description of the mandate and the responsibilities of each entity within the college. Role education, everyone involved in the direction and operations of the college has to be oriented to their mandate and their responsibilities. They have to understand how what they do relates to the other entities within the college. Role evaluation, every piece of the college, every committee, council, staff, they should be accountable for their activities. They should report on what they've done and receive feedback on their performance. And then finally, enforcement, where a person or an entity within the college is not participating appropriately in the college affairs, despite a clear explanation, appropriate education and evaluation, then there has to be a means of enforcing the college's expectations. And of course, you have a council code of conduct and you've got rules regarding disqualification for serious misconduct, if you will. So really the guiding principles focus on the public interest. Council leads and directs, and we'll talk about how you lead and direct. The registrar has that unique role. The work of statutory committees like registration, discipline are separate from the work of council. And just because you are on council doesn't mean that you have a right to know, for example, why a committee made a particular decision, essentially on a need to know basis. So the flow of information from about council activities is different than the flow of information about committee activities. You don't have individual authority as council members. Your authority comes from council as a whole. And once you make a decision, the sort of saying is that council speaks with one voice. So you have to support the decision after it's made. And the president, I'll have to change the slide to say chair, really facilitates and coordinates. So the chair as well doesn't have any individual authority, if you will. The chair's role really is to help council do its work and to facilitate discussions around the council table. So the general principles in terms of policy, certainly for the policies that the board makes that relate to the membership, you set those policy and you make those decisions, but you don't administer them. Once you make a decision about a standard, for example, it's the registrar and staff who administer those. With respect to operational decision, the registrar, of course, makes those policies himself in this case. So the registrar's role is to propose and advise and administer when we're talking about policies that face the profession. Consultants like myself, we advise, but we don't make decisions. And members, and sorry, this word stakeholder is not in favor, it should be system partners. They make submissions when they're impacted, but they don't decide. So the membership is entitled to consultation. They're entitled to provide feedback before you make decisions, but they don't actually make decisions. And of course, CDHO Council is moving away from the policy governance model. And I have a few slides that hopefully will help articulate for you and illustrate sort of the different way that you would approach a problem based on different governance models. So role of council, again, steering, not rowing. That's one of those little sayings that always sort of helps what we're doing now. Are we steering or are we rowing? Council is supposed to steer, staff rows. With respect to how you do that steering, it's through leadership, with integrity. You do your due diligence, you ask questions. Financial oversight, of course, is one of the most important things that you do. Risk management. You work with the registrar to help identify, assess, treat, and monitor risk, especially reputational risk, but sometimes legal and financial risk as well, but you work with the registrar in partnership to do that. So an example that I just mentioned about sort of describing the different governance ways to approach an issue. So let's use this as an example. Let's say that there was an issue at the college where it appeared that the college was dealing with a backlog of complaints. And it was actually taking, let's say, 6 years, an excessive amount of time to investigate complaints and before they could be either referred to discipline or otherwise disposed of. And so the colors I've chosen on this slide are sort of an illustration of my view about the wisdom of each approach. So if council was interfering in operational matters, which is the red part of the slide, then it might choose to review the investigation steps in individual complaint matters and give suggestions to the registrar. So that's what the council interference would look like. It's probably not wise, and it's not a good use of council's time, and council also doesn't have the expertise to do it. So red means bad in this slide. A policy governance approach might have council noting that the divisional court in Ontario has overturned, a number of CDHO discipline decisions on the basis of undue delay and abusive process. And then in that regard, when council did its performance review of the CEO, it would identify that as a failure. And so yellow means probably, an okay approach. A council steering or a collaborative approach, what I've got in green, might have like a dashboard or another reporting tool for council to demonstrate to council that there was this growing delay in investigations of complaints. And seeing that, council would ask the registrar for an explanation. They would ask the registrar to create a plan to address this growing backlog and delay, and it would ask what it can do to help, such as allocating funds from the budget to increase complaint staff. So in my view, this is the porridge that's just right, the green one. So I, as you know, I was not a huge fan of policy governance. I'm a huge fan of council steering and the collaborative approach. So Michelle, does that help at all, sort of giving that example about the different approaches, different ways that you would treat the same kind of problem?
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you, Julie.
Okay, good. And so with respect to operational matters, so within the purview of, Glenn, council provides really high level oversight to the registrar. So your role is not to get into the weeds. And remember, you're steering, not rowing. And so for those operational matters, it's often sort of graphs and tables and charts are really the best sort of optimal level of reporting that would go to council. And financial statements, if you think about it, are a form of a dashboard. And of course, your council package is full of, charts, tables, graphs that provide really valuable information to you. And of course, the college performance measurement framework, like your reporting tool, has appendices that include helpful dashboards. And so comparing those over time or against similar other regulators can provide a lot of information for council. as long as the information is comparable, of course. Some colleges count their days of, for example, investigations and hearings differently. So you have to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples. So the role of counsel in relation to operational matters is to identify sort of warning signs and ask the appropriate questions of the registrar. So like in the last slide, the important questions would be what's happening? And for example, with the delay thing, maybe there was an innocent explanation. Let's say there was a really unusual, complicated case that skewed the statistics. Second question, what's your plan? And here you would show deference, and you would only intervene if the registrar's plan is obviously inadequate. And then third, how can we help? So adding resources or reallocating resources might be necessary. And of course, just to note that the CDHO does have a dashboard for the patient experience. You've got a dashboard, I think, for the registration experience as well. And Glenn advises that you're developing a risk management dashboard. So I think that's going to be very helpful. Glenn, did you want to chime in?
No, that's absolutely accurate.
Okay.
We have 2 dashboards now, and we're just compiling all of the data and the metrics that we will use to put together the risk dashboard as well.
Okay, perfect. So compared to, so we just dealt with sort of your level of oversight with operational matters. When you're dealing with guidance to the profession, your role is quite different than when the oversight that you provide are operational matters. Your role when you're providing guidance to the profession, or even like rules by way of regulations, bylaws, standards, policies, is different. And so for the purposes of this slide, I'm going to refer to those as policy matters. I know that might be a bit confusing given that you have previously used policy governance, but the courts use the term policy in that way. When we're talking about regulatory policy, they're talking about decisions that council makes that impact the profession, such as standards of practice that a member has to comply with. So when the decision that you are making relates to advice, guidance, or rules to the profession, then college staff advises, but it's council that decides. So you need to make sure that you have enough information to make a decision about the particular policy, bylaw, standard. And then you need to analyze the information that you have. Then you need to say what the rationale is for the decision that you ultimately make, including the various factors listed at the bottom of this slide. So how does this impact the public interest? What are the risk management principles? How is this, like the right touch regulation? Is that, are we balancing competing interests such as freedom of expression rights of your members? And you need to make sure, of course, that you have legal authority to make the policy, bylaw, or standard. And of course, you find that in the RHPA and the Health Professions Procedural Code. So a traditional briefing note identifies the issues that have to be determined or addressed. It describes the outcome of the research that took place. It articulates the options available. It summarizes the results of any consultation that took place, sets out the advantages and disadvantages for each option, possibly makes a recommendation, proposes an implementation plan, and then specifies the way or the method for monitoring and reviewing the impact of the policy. Because of course, you don't make policy just for the sake of making policy. You make policy to try to protect the public interest and benefit the public. And so you want to monitor the decisions you make to make sure that they're having a positive effect. In recent years, though, the role played by briefing notes has in fact expanded. And it has come to sort of be seen as a component of the board's risk management and governance functions. And so as a result, briefing notes also identify that the topic of the policy is about a risk that's worth addressing. Like that it's serious enough for council's attention, really. So the analysis portion of the briefing note evaluates the nature of the risk to help understand it better, sort of its root causes and the impact of the existing measures to try to reduce that risk. Also important, of course, is a sort of a comprehensive review of the possible measures or ways to address the risk. including the possible unintended consequences of each of those options. And so that's where the concept of like right touch regulation is important. And of course, briefing notes help regulators become more transparent in the work that they do. But beyond all of that good stuff, briefing notes actually now have an important legal role too, because late last year, the Supreme Court of Canada sort of pronounced on its recent, on how its sort of recent emphasis on the rule of law in administrative law would affect challenges to the validity of things like regulations, bylaws, and standards. And so while the issue in the case, it's called Auer, A-U-E-R, related to child support guidelines, the Supreme Court of Canada was clearly providing general guidance that should be considered by professional regulators in their decision-making process. So the court said that subordinate legislation, so like, you know, there's a hierarchy of law and policies, regulations, bylaws, standards are at the lower end. They're subordinate to the act itself. And in this case, the enabling provisions are the code and the RHPA. So the court said that though that sort of lower level law legislation has to be reasonably authorized by the enabling statute, like the code and the RHPA. And the court signaled that there's going to be a slightly less deferential approach by courts when reviewing administrative policy decisions. So to manage this slightly increased legal risk, you should make sure that any proposed changes to your regulations, bylaws, rules, standards are accompanied by a briefing note that explains the purpose and the goals of the proposal, its relation to the objects in the RHPA, and the research and analysis behind the proposal. And ideally, the briefing note would also explicitly reference the provisions in the RHPA that authorize the proposed change. And a good briefing note can provide really strong evidence on behalf of the regulator that the decision being made is in fact consistent with the enabling statute. And a recent example of that is Hardick and College of Chiropractors of Ontario. And that case involved a bylaw amendment that the Council of the College of Chiropractors was passed to extend the sort of the cooling off period for prospective board members. So anybody who had a discipline history, it was going from, it was 3 years and then it was going to be 6 years. They were going to double the waiting time, the cooling off period between when you were had a discipline finding and you could serve on council. And so a prospective candidate, Dr. Hardick, he challenged the bylaw, saying that it was targeting him because he had a discipline history, and the bylaw change was made after he expressed to the college that he had an interest in serving on the board. So he brought an application for judicial review to court to challenge the bylaw, and the court denied his request. So in denying that, his request for an interim stay, like an interim halting of the bylaw, he wanted it to be halted so that it didn't go into force until this next election. So he wanted to be eligible for the next election. The court noted that the college's transparent policy-making process that included this really terrific briefing note made it unlikely that he would be able to prove bad faith or improper motive on the part of the college. Ultimately in the court case. So the college's really thorough briefing note on the issue was crucial in having the bylaw stand up to a court challenge. And finally, the Supreme Court of Canada also imposed sort of a heightened burden on regulators to explain their decisions in a case that just from last year called Commission Scolaire and Northwest Territories. And so the case dealt with Francophone language rights, but the Supreme Court said that even where the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is not breached by an administrative decision, the state, and regulators are seen as sort of agents or quasi-state agents, they have to consider charter values when making discretionary decisions like making policy or regulations, bylaws, and standards. So even though a board making a policy decision typically doesn't give sort of formal reasons for the decision the way that a discipline committee would, a comprehensive briefing note would go a long way to meeting this other duty to consider charter values. Again, assuming your briefing note addresses charter values. And an example of that might be if the standard that you're making is about advertising by dental hygienists, your briefing note should reference freedom of expression, because that's the balancing. You know, if you're saying that you can only advertise in a certain way, that impacts a dental hygienist's right to freedom of expression, which is a charter value. So let's look at an example. So that was just sort of my guidance generally. Let's look at an example of a decision that council might make that gives guidance to the profession. So assume that council is considering developing a whistleblower policy in which anonymous concerns can be brought to the attention of the CDHO by members of the public or members of the profession, but only for the purpose of systemic change, unless the person reporting wanted to become identified. So it's for the purpose of anonymous systemic change. The reporter can remain anonymous. What would council's role be in developing that kind of policy? So first, you'd have to consider the public interest. How would that kind of policy protect the public interest? Any thoughts from anybody? Would that kind of a policy impact or protect the public interest? And there's no wrong answers. Safe space. Anne Marie.
Yeah, I think it would have an element of protection for the public, because if, you know, you were debating whether to come forward with something that you're observing and you know that you're going to be protected, then you might be more likely to come forward, which would then in hand provide more protection for the public if something is whatever they're blowing the whistle on has the potential to harm the public.
Yeah, exactly. It could be a source of information to guide future focus of the college. It could be also transparent to the public about, you know, recurring concerns. And of course, transparency is good. On the flip side, it would probably allow for very little individual action because it's about systemic change. So absolutely, overall, it would probably be good for the public interest. So what would be the risk management aspect of the proposal? Any thoughts about what's the risk management aspect of this kind of proposal? It identifies the source of risks. Oops, sorry, Michelle, I jumped in. What were your thoughts?
That's okay, no worries. I'm probably not correct with this, but there could be complaints made in bad faith that if they didn't have to put their name on it, you know, there could be some complaints that were not in good faith.
Yeah, you'd have to think about that risk as well, like the negative risk of the unintended consequences. And so that's one of the risks that you would have to manage as well. One of the positive risks that might be that it will identify the sources of risk, like if there's a particular part of the system that is not working, and if there's a repeated, whether it's infection control or something like that, that could be a positive. But absolutely, so there's different both negative and positive risks. Is this a right touch response to a problem? Probably. It provides an outlet for people, as Anne-Marie said, who are unwilling to make a formal complaint. But again, you may end up on the flip side with an inability to act in serious cases because of the anonymity of the reporter. You would have a difficult time going forward to discipline. How would you make sure that the policy balances competing interests, including charter values? Any thoughts? That's perhaps a little bit of a tricky one, but if a registrant who's allegedly engaged in inappropriate conduct was ultimately named by the college, it would definitely be unfair to them. So, you know, the decision that you, in terms of balancing those interests, you probably require that members whose conduct is an issue are not going to be named in the, you know, ultimate reporting that goes out, unless the reporter comes forward and is also prepared to be named. So that could be the balancing of that fairness aspect. What about ensuring legal authority for the proposal? What do you have to consider? I think you'd want to think about, can you in fact assure anonymity? Can you in fact guarantee that the whistleblower's identity is not going to be disclosed, given that you've got disclosure requirements and onerous ones that apply to regulators? But again, maybe given that you are not ultimately taking action against individual registrants, perhaps that wouldn't apply. And so just FYI, the UK health regulators, the United Kingdom, they actually do this, and they report on their learnings annually. So this is sort of a real life proposal that the UK at least has put into place. So I think I can sort of skip over this. We've already talked a little bit about the ways that council meets its leadership responsibilities. I know that you're working very closely with Kevin about the strategic direction as well. You know, of course, that your financial and legal stewardship, those are the work that council really needs to focus on. But the way that you monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of your decisions, of course, reports, whether they're from council reports, committee reports, independent third parties like Harry Caton, Deanna Williams, and of course, review of your financial results. So it is, of course, recognized that it is, in fact, difficult to balance your obligation to provide that oversight role while not interfering in staff functions. But it's something that, it's a balance that you got to get right, because you've got, first of all, a duty to prevent regulatory failures, such as overlooking serious misconduct on the part of staff. But on the flip side, council really can't effectively perform the day-to-day operations. You don't have the expertise to do it. If you do it, you won't have time for the high-level risk management and strategic direction decisions. And also, we know from other regulators where this happens, staff will go somewhere else. They'll leave if they're not able to do their jobs without interference. So one of the ways to sort of prevent interfering is to make sure that council and the registrar agree on which policies are within the purview of council versus the registrar. So, that the sort of the mantra that boards make policy and CEO executes it, it's standard, but that really the debate is what policy are we talking about? So clarifying that policy setting role of both council and the CEO is really crucial to make sure that the college runs effectively. So boards responsible on policies that relate to governing the CDHO, like which governance model you're going to use, your mission, your strategic goals, how you're going to monitor the organizational effects. But purely administrative policies are established by the registrar, and they really shouldn't even be discussed on the board agendas. So I mentioned earlier, your authority comes from council as a whole. Independent council members, individual council members have no role independent of council. You can't act unilaterally. Your role really is to participate in council and committee meetings and deliberations, abide by your fiduciary duties. And again, that constituency model does not apply. So your fiduciary obligation, so while you don't have individual authority, you do have individual obligations. So you've got burdens and not that many benefits individually anyway. So you have to comply with your fiduciary duties. And of course, consensus building happens when you have trust and collegiality and when you treat each other with respect. So the standard of care, that is sort of like what level, you're not expected to be perfect. The standard of care is really that of a reasonably prudent person in similar circumstances. So you would exercise the care, diligence, and skill of a reasonably prudent person. And so the business judgment requires that council members make sure that you're informed and you exercise reasonable care when you're making decisions, and you make appropriate use of experts when you don't have the necessary expertise, whether that's public relations, government relations, law, finances. You rely on experts when you need to. Diligence, make sure that your fiduciary obligation, make sure that you prepare for meetings, you show up on time, you participate in discussions, but you also pay attention so that if the person in front of you said the point you were about to, then you can just put your hand down. And I know that council's gotten a lot better at that over time. Also, make sure that you vote. My view is that if you abstain, that means that the system is not working properly. If you have a conflict of interest, you shouldn't be in the room at all. So abstention means that the system isn't working. Ideally, you'll be voting either for or against based on whether you think the decision is in the public interest. So abstentions really shouldn't happen. Respect, you want to make sure that you're paying attention, you're not on your mobile device. It doesn't mean, though, that you have to have consensus or agreement before the vote is taken. And it doesn't prevent you from, asking for more information or challenging inappropriate comments. But once a vote is taken, then everyone has to support that. And it really requires genuine listening and consideration, and not making up your mind before you come. So you want to come with an open mind and recognize that sometimes the debate around the table will actually change your preliminary view of something. Ethical behavior, you don't want to be on the front of the Toronto Star for buying a $30 glass of orange juice. I always remember that one member of parliament, somebody went to England at some point for, I don't know, Olympics, and had like a $30 glass of orange juice. And that's something that newspapers can easily understand as being a boondoggle. You don't want to have that. You want to make sure that the integrity of council members is really above and beyond reproach. Be honest if you're going to be, late for a meeting or not available. You want to be honest about the reason. You can't be subject to inappropriate influence by, for example, the professional association. You also should not be trying to inappropriately influence the decision of others around the table. The discussion should happen around the council table, not behind the scenes. And certainly discussions about a decision that was made afterwards with the profession is risky, because it may be that you, in fact, mischaracterize what happened. So ideally, you will just point to the public information on the website, or suggest that the person asking, contact the registrar. So obviously you need to comply with your fiduciary duties, but part of that means learning what they are. So make sure that you look at the bylaws, the governance council, council manual. Make sure that you report as well breaches by either yourself or by colleagues. Your fiduciary obligation means, of course, that you have to not turn a blind eye if you see problems that happen. So in this particular, here's an example of in terms of a fiduciary duty. During a break in a council meeting, you overhear a member of a particular committee describing a fascinating item on that committee's agenda involving kickbacks for dental appliances. And they're doing it in a way that could identify the laboratory involved to anyone listening. So how do you respond to that? So of course, the way that you respond in any particular situation, whatever the circumstances, is going to depend on the circumstances. But in this case, pretending that you didn't hear it is not a good way to address it. It's really abdicating your own fiduciary obligations. It may be that a private conversation with the council member, at least as a start, but it might not be enough, because you don't know if this is an ongoing problem or not. So likely reporting to staff or the chair of the committee is a good starting point, in addition to having a chat with the committee member. This kind of issue is, if it's a one-off isolated incident, it's probably going to be dealt with educationally. Going back to the role education, reminding them of the need to keep information confidential, the need of separation of committee and council. It's unlikely that this would lead to a formal code of conduct complaint unless there had been a pattern of problematic behavior. Any questions before I move on? No. Okay. So committee work, as we mentioned, that's adjudicative committees, like registration, fitness to practice, patient relations. You work independent of council, and the accountability to council is really at a high level, sort of on a statistical basis. The ICRC dealt with X number of complaints in the last year, and 2 were referred to discipline, for example. So it's really only on that level. Unless you're on the particular panel, you're not entitled to know why a decision was made, for example. So let's move to some scenarios for discussion. Going back to sort of our governance discussion that we're talking about and brainstorming about council work, what dashboards do you think are the most important to the council work that you do, and why? Any thoughts? Erin.
I would say a dashboard dealing with whatever the item is, like the level of risk. that would be attached to that particular item. So whether, you know, it's sort of like color coded, whether that means red, this is a high risk, you know, council should be focusing their attention on this particular item, whether it's yellow, like we want to kind of keep an eye on it, or green perhaps might be relatively a low risk. So just having the level of risk reflected or at least considered in the dashboard for an item.
Yep, perfect. And that, I think that's what Glenn says that they're working on. We could call it our Goldilocks dashboard, right? It's, you know, just perfect. We want everything green. Any other thoughts? Do you think of a dashboard that you don't have yet, other than the risk management one that's being worked on, but that would help you do your work? No? You got everything you need? Glenn's happy. So it's also important to think about the financial statements are probably one of the most important dashboards. Like they're hard because some of us, our brains don't work that with numbers that well, but and right now, because the college is in a really healthy financial situation, it's something that you don't really have to think too much about. But should that ever change, who knows what could happen? And, you know, the government might say, we want you to do this now, and it costs a lot of money. You would have the primary responsibility to address the issue. So the financial statements are really an important dashboard as well to keep in mind. So how about another scenario? So council is considering how to enhance the practice advisory services offered by the college. And one option that's discussed is to use council members who are also members of the profession to fulfill this function. And they can do so from home using their own electronic devices. And it's proposed that the per diem for this would be $400 a day. Can you identify any concerns with that proposal? Michelle?
Consistency amongst the members of the profession that would be offering advice.
Okay, anything a little more glaring? Jennifer?
Yes, I would say the confidentiality of the service provided, assuming that they're using their own electronic devices.
Yeah.
The money.
Michelle? Sorry, Michelle?
Oh, sorry. Erin, did you have your hand up? It's quite, it's a lot of money as well.
Yep, and keep going with the money piece. So we talked about confidentiality, something else that starts with CO.
Conflict of interest.
Yeah. So really, like it wouldn't pass the smell test. It definitely would be a conflict of interest about getting paid. Definitely confidentiality, because the records are going to be on personal computers and phones, and there might be a risk of being overheard. Might even be a lack of oversight, which goes back to the consistency piece, like who's going to be watching this happen? Maybe even a lack of records of information that might be needed if there's a lawsuit or some kind of disclosure that has to happen. Also, arguably, an assumption, perhaps unfounded, we don't know, but it's just an assumption that the council members have the knowledge and skill to actually do this, right? So yeah, so definitely conflict of interest wouldn't be a good one. So when we say that conflict of interest is inevitable, it is, but we don't want to set up scenarios that actually like scream conflict of interest. But because you are all sort of at the top of your game, you're involved in many, many different things, and lots of you are educators as well. There will be instances where conflict of interest happens. And the important thing is, it's not bad when it happens. It's bad if you don't recognize it, and it's bad if you don't recuse yourself and stay out of the particular decision. So really, a conflict of interest is when you've got a competing either duty or interest that a reasonable person, so not you, someone else looking from the outside in, would think that you're going to be influenced by that competing duty. And the goal really of the rules and the bylaws is to minimize those occurrences. And then, of course, when they happen, you have to manage them. So this really is an area of risk for a lot of colleges. We've seen some playing out in the media recently at our, at some of the other RHPA colleges. and they can be disruptive and problematic, and they tend to bring disrepute to the college. So it really warrants an entire presentation on that and on boundaries. But it's really crucial to keep this foremost. So where where you do have this other competing interest, you don't participate in making the decisions. You don't participate in the pre-discussion either, so that you don't sit around the table and have the full debate and then just leave when the vote's about to happen. You have to not be participating at all. In a virtual world, you would be put into like a separate waiting room, and Veronica would bring you back when it's done. But the discussion, any of the decisions that you have to make they must be made in the public interest without those competing considerations. And the risks of not doing this are pretty serious. They can result in the decisions being overturned. There's certainly reputational risk, but they can happen anytime. So you always have to be aware of it. It can arise partway through a discussion when you didn't even think that it was going to arise. But you have to think, is it because of my position, should I be involved in this discussion? And so I know in the past where you've made decisions about exams and things like that, that some of the educators in the room have in fact declared a conflict and not been involved. You also have to think of your relationships. Because of your relationship with a certain person or a certain entity, should I be involved in this discussion or of the situation? So the obvious kinds of conflicts are financial, and those are not the most likely to happen around the council table. They're usually about issues. Like, is the issue one that I've got a closed mind about, so that I shouldn't, I've spoken about this before and everyone knows my position on this, so I'm not going to be persuaded. I won't be coming with an open mind. The organizational ones, and you've got those usually baked into the bylaws. You can't also be on the board of directors of the professional association, right? Like that you would constantly be in a conflict. So some of those are true conflicts. Some of them are more of an appearance. Where you're on discipline or ICRC, we talk about it more in terms of bias, the reasonable apprehension of bias. Do you know one of the parties? Do you know the complainant or the registrant? And so for those instances, you would not be able to make a decision. But it also might be an issue. It doesn't have to just be the person, it might be the issue that's being dealt with as well. So you have to put the college's interest ahead of your own. You can't have a divided loyalty or a competing sort of serious personal interest. And these are just sort of some examples of them. So few of the rules are absolute, other than, of course, being on the board of directors of the professional association. It usually depends on the circumstances. So if you are concerned about conflict of interest, you want to consult with the chair or the registrar, ideally in advance of the meeting if you see what the topic is. If you've got any doubt, disclose, and ultimately council would deliberate and vote. Usually it doesn't come to that. Usually if there's a recognition that you've got a conflict, you would absent yourself from the meeting and make sure that you don't try to influence the decision on your way out. Like, I'm saying, this is the stupidest decision you would ever make, but I have a conflict, so I'm leaving. You can't have that kind of conversation, and you shouldn't be involved in the pre-debate either. So then the tricky part is, what if you think somebody else has a conflict of interest? Again, sort of goes back to where you hear somebody say something that's a breach of confidentiality. If you think another council member or committee member has a conflict, but they don't declare it, and it doesn't look like they're going to declare it, again, you would be abdicating your responsibility if you don't do something about it. So start with having a conversation with that person. And ideally that will result in them going, oh gosh, you're right, I hadn't even thought of that. Yes, you're right, I have to leave. If that's not going to work or doesn't work, then you would approach the chair of council or the chair of the particular committee, the registrar, who likely would have a conversation. And if self-declaration still doesn't happen, then it would be raised at the issue, and the council or the committee would ultimately vote and might vote you off the island for that particular agenda item. But you can't just sit by if you think somebody has a conflict. So it's important to think about that. Again, appearance of bias really relates to more of those adjudicative decisions. Relatively rare is it about money, but theoretically it could. So I think I'm a little ahead of my time, but we have certainly we can have lots of time for questions. Essentially, remember who you represent. It's the public interest. You don't represent a particular district. You have an obligation. You've got fiduciary obligations of undivided loyalty and diligence to the college's mandate. individual council members don't have any role separate and apart from council. You get all of your authority from council working together. You want to make sure that you're prepared for council meetings. You ask questions in advance. If you think that there's not enough information available to be able to make the decision, you ask in advance so that you don't say, well, I'm going to abstain because I don't think we have enough information. You ask for the information so that you have enough information to make a decision. Once council makes the decision, you speak with one voice, and there's actually case law dealing with this concept. Often it's in the context of sort of municipal kinds of boards, but the analogies are the same. That if a decision is made and you are voting against it, once it's made, you cannot go out and sort of denigrate the decision and badmouth the decision to the rest of the profession or to system partners. If you do, that's a breach of your fiduciary obligations. If it was on a decision made about an important issue and you simply cannot support it, then the only way that you can comply with your fiduciary obligations is to resign from council, because otherwise you would be breaching your fiduciary duties. So be familiar with the code of conduct, make sure that you comply with it. You can't comply with something you don't know what's in it, so make sure that you read it and make sure that you maintain confidentiality at all times. So self-regulation, even modified self-regulation that we have in Ontario, and we have it modified because you've got public members on council, because you are accountable to the Ministry of Health. You have to report to the Ministry of Health. The legislation can be unilaterally changed without your input. If you think it's a privilege that's worth keeping, then you have to do certain things in order to maintain that. And in Ontario, the Ministry of Health has been relatively, I don't know, in some stages it's a little more off, like keeping out of your business. And in some instances, it's been more intrusive in terms of changes that it makes to the RHPA when it thinks that colleges are not doing things like treating sexual abuse seriously enough. Like you see unilateral changes to the RHPA. So if you think self-regulation, even modified self-regulation, is worth keeping, then you need to make sure that you keep public interest at the forefront of all of your decisions. Regulating a profession is difficult. It's complicated. You've got those competing interests. You've got expectations of transparency on one hand, but also expectations of maintaining confidentiality. So you've got those competing and sometimes inconsistent expectations. So what you want to do is think about good governance. Again, it's not a goal in and of itself. It's a means to achieving the goals that the RHPA says that you need to achieve. So focus on the important things, those 4 core regulatory activities that are set out in the RHPA. Learn from the experience of other colleges, even if it's in different provinces, even if it's the College of Dentists from BC. Those regulatory failures, you can learn a lot about what not to do, which helps you become a more effective council. And above all else, put the public interest at the forefront. And so we have lots of time for questions if anyone has any. Let me stop sharing so I can see all of you.
Karen.
Thanks. That was great, Julie. Even though I've been on council for a number of years, it's always a great refresher. And I always end up learning something new whenever you come to speak to us. So thanks. That was great. I had a couple of questions just with respect to your portion of the presentation dealing with briefing notes. I think it was when you were talking about, I think it was like Dr. Hardick. I was just wondering if there was any, in your opinion, if in terms of like the content of the briefing note, you had mentioned that like it may contain a recommendation. I was just wondering if in terms of maybe like best practices, whether you know, there might also be an opportunity for a discussion of alternatives or other options that were considered and then rejected, and then reasons for that, you know, for not for rejecting or not recommending those other options, or if it's more appropriate for that to be sort of like light to be shed on that particular issue through like the role of council. Like if, you know, council members should be asking those questions, okay, here's the recommendation, what other sort of options were considered and why were those options rejected, and for what reasons were those rejected?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's actually like an excellent point, and it would probably assist council to have that in the briefing note so that you knew that exec or the registrar, whoever was making the recommendation, had considered the other options and the reasons for it, for rejecting it. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with their, like the reason that they rejected it, but knowing that they put their mind to it and thought about the pros and cons and the unintended consequences of A, B, or C, I think would probably be quite helpful to council. So I'd be interested to see if others think that as well. I don't think there's any harm in doing that. It's certainly not meant to stifle debate, like, so that, you know, like, you wouldn't want the perception of the briefing note to be, we've answered all your questions, so don't put your hand up during this presentation, right? Like, so I think you're right. It's again, one of those, where do we find the balance of how much information to put in there? But I would think that it would be quite helpful to put in.
And I just had a second question just on the briefing notes then too, just with respect to, I think you were referring to the SEC decision. Was there any discussion and you think that perhaps there's a bit of a shift, like maybe less deferential in terms of the decisions and like how that's why those briefing notes are so important. Was there any mention in the decision about the importance of good minutes to show that there was council deliberation on that particular topic as well? Or was the focus on the briefing note itself and less like minutes or another like evidentiary basis upon which the decision was made?
Well, not in that particular case, but certainly in Hardick there was, because in addition to the briefing note, the divisional court, the minutes from the meeting were presented as well as part of the affidavit evidence for the college. And the divisional court was particularly struck by how all of the public members on council voted for the bylaw change. Like they believed that it was in the public interest. So I think that in fact, something like the minutes and having fulsome, good minutes also could be a very, very helpful tool. So it's not just one or the other, but I think Hardick is a good example of that, where the divisional court was like really persuaded by the fact that all of the public members voted for it. Any other questions?
I have a question, Julie. What is your view or standpoint on the use of social media by council members or committee members, non-council members, just discussing council work?
And you probably have something in your policies, Glenn. Is there anything in the bylaws? I don't know off the top of my head, or every college is a little bit different. We're talking about college work. Some colleges take the position that, well, we want our council members to, you know, be sort of showcasing the decisions we make. And so we're fine having them sort of, you know, like or tweet or repost a decision of council. But the tricky part is if you're talking about a decision that was made, especially after the fact, that's where the difficulty, you sometimes will get into difficulty, because someone will interpret what you're saying as, well, that's not what the decision was. And so it can get quite tricky. Certainly, so it's easy to say, like, you know, don't be racist, don't be sexist, but we're just like that kind of stuff. But if we're talking about council work, that's something that probably council will have to put its mind to, and before somebody does something you don't like, it probably makes sense to include that in your governance manual to say, this is what our expectation is. You either, if you're going to do it, these are the sort of strict parameters, that you just repost something that we did, but you don't sort of debate it. But I'm happy to hear what Glenn thinks on that.
Yeah, I think that, you know, we really do want to engage the good things of social media in terms of getting our messaging out, but it's always a double-edged sword. I'm sort of mindful of the notion that, you know, traditionally there are two spokespersons for the college. One is the chair and the other is the registrar, and the people who actually do the work around, you know, creating the messaging are the communications people in the college. So we have a whole division of communications people that actually craft all of the messaging that we feel is relevant to, you know, the public and informing the public and all of our community members. And so I think that we continue, even with social media, want to be the leader in that regard. Like we will craft the messaging. Members of council hopefully will see it go out, and then they're always welcome to amplify it in a way, by reposting or that sort of thing. But as far as creating individual messages around initiatives, that are associated with the work of the council, I think that our preference is, and again, this is about risk management as well. Our preference is that it comes from within the organization and is broadcasted that way. Does that make sense?
Julie, would that not come under our awareness of a risk to our reputation?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what you would have to think about when you make the decision about whether council should be allowed to do these things, like what your view is. Absolutely, that's part of what like it would go to reputational risk. It would also, if there's inconsistent messaging, it's going to confuse the profession. So absolutely, it's part of your risk management role. So it's actually a terrific question that Michelle asked, so that you can get some consensus about what you think council's role in this regard, or should or shouldn't be, or the parameters of what you can say about, on social media about the college's work. I think we're not going to settle it today, but I think we already know from Glenn that the preference is that really you can repost, but you don't sort of re-debate or try to explain in your own words sort of a council or a college decision or initiative. Any other
Great.
questions?
Thanks so much, Julie. Any other questions for Julie? We still have a couple minutes, but happy to end early. Thank you so much, Julie. I will echo Erin's comment. I always learn something from you, and you are so well versed in this topic, and you've given us a very good reminder related to our role as council members and our very important responsibilities. So once again, thank you, and we look forward to seeing you in March. And yeah.
Okay, you're very welcome. It's always a pleasure.
Okay, so we are a few minutes early. I think it's okay for us to break now and return at 1:30, if that's the will of council. A couple extra minutes for lunch, so perfect. All right, so we'll see everyone back at 1:30. Thank you.
Just going to give everyone just a moment to return. I think some people are still in the breakout room. There we go. So welcome back. Thanks everyone for participating in orientation earlier. We've returned now for the election. Turn over chairing to Dr. Glenn Pettifer, our registrar. Glenn? You're on mute.
I don't say it. Thank you, Terry, and welcome to everyone. Happy New Year to everyone, and in particular welcome to the new members of council. It's a great time to be involved in the work of the CDHO, and we're really looking forward to all the great things that we can accomplish in 2025. May we live in interesting times. So for the election today, one of the first pieces will be the appointment of scrutineers. And I will be, I'm asking for a motion to appoint Eric Bruce and Suzanne Fox as scrutineers for this election, which will take place online.
I'll move.
Seconded by Aaron Betts. All in favor? By show of hand. Thank you. So thank you, Eric and Suzanne, and they will wait in a breakout room to confirm the counts. So this election occurs once a year, and because I'm not practicing my election skills all the time, I have a script. So I'm going to be reading from the script to make sure that I don't deviate from process. And also we have our legal counsel in the background as well, should any questions arise. So I think that we're in good hands. So I'll be conducting this election in accordance with Schedule 2 as part of the bylaws. Nominations to any position on the executive committee may be either by self, you can nominate yourself, or from any members of council. The executive committee consists of a maximum of 5 council members, 5, elected by council annually. All council members are eligible for election to the executive committee. 3 members on the executive committee must be registrants of the college. They'll be the professional members of council. And the remaining 2 members of the executive committee must be publicly appointed members of council. There is no limitation on the number of years a council member may sit on the executive committee. However, each position has a maximum number of aggregate years that may be served as follows. The chair, 3 years. You can only be chair 3 years. You can only be vice chair 3 years, and you can only be an executive member, not either the chair or the vice chair, for 3 years as well. So the process will begin with a call for nominations for the position of chair, and then I will work through the vice chair and then call for nominations for the remaining 3 executive member positions. I'll call for nominations until there are no more nominations. Then I'll make a second, and just for clarity, I'll make a second and third and final call for nominations, and receiving no additional nominations, I'll close the nominations. At that point, should only 1 council member be a candidate for the position, I'll declare that position, or I'll declare that candidate elected by acclamation. Should there be more than 1 candidate for a single position, an electronic election using the Board Effect platform by secret ballot shall be conducted. Each nominated candidate who accepts the nomination will be given an opportunity to briefly address council. As I mentioned, the Board Effect, the election will be carried out on the Board Effect platform. And should there be an election, Veronica will create the ballots by loading the names of the nominees into the ballot. And if we do find that we need to have an election, I'll describe the details of that process further. But I shall now proceed to the election of the chair. And I'll begin by calling for nominations for the position of chair. And you can raise your hand or just speak. Terry.
I'd like to nominate Michelle Atkinson.
Thank you. And Michelle, do you accept?
I do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other nominations for the position of chair of the executive committee? And are there any other nominations for the position of chair of the executive committee? Nominations are closed for the position of chair, and seeing only one nomination, Michelle Atkinson, I note that Michelle is acclaimed as chair of the executive committee for 2025. Yay, Michelle. Would you
Thank
like to make
you.
any comments, Michelle?
Can I do it at the end after everyone
Yeah,
is?
absolutely.
Okay,
Sure.
thanks.
Yeah. Well,
Thank you.
congratulations. Okay. All right, moving on to the election of vice chair. I will now conduct the election for vice chair. Are there any nominations for the position of vice chair? Yes, Margaret, I see your hand.
I nominate Terry Strawn.
Thank you. Terry, do you accept?
Yes, I do.
And just to confirm, you haven't filled this position before.
I've never been VP now.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Correct.
Are there other nominations for the position of vice chair? And I'll ask a third and final time, are there any other nominations for vice chair? All right, nominations are closed for the position of vice chair, and Terry Strawn is acclaimed as vice chair for 2025. Congratulations. Terry, would you like to say anything?
Sure, I'll be super quick because I didn't get to talk this morning. Thank you, Margaret. I'm really happy to support Michelle in your year as chair. So thank you, Council, for having the confidence to allow me to return to exec for my last year. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I will now conduct the election for the three remaining positions on the executive committee. Since we already have two members of the profession serving as chair and vice chair, then we need to elect a third member of the profession who sits on council to fill the executive member position available to the professional member. So I'm now looking for nominations for a professional member of council to sit on the executive committee. Yes, Margaret.
I nominate Vanessa Piera.
Thank you. Vanessa, do you accept?
I do. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other nominations for the position of professional member on the executive committee? And I'll ask a third and final time, are there any other nominations for this position? Seeing none, I'll note that nominations are closed and Vanessa Piera is acclaimed as member of the executive committee for 2025. Congratulations, Vanessa.
Thank you.
Moving on to members of the executive committee who are public appointees to the CDHO Council. And I will call for nominations for and actually, this is a question I have for Julia as we started on this, because we have two positions. Can we call for nominations to fill both of those positions, Julie, or do you think that we should deal with them individually?
I would suggest dealing with them individually. I think that's the safer. I'm looking at Schedule 2. It says they're to be done on the similar basis to the ones that you just did. So I think one at a time is preferred.
Okay, sure. All right, we'll deal with them individually then. I'm looking for nominations for one of the positions of public appointee on the council to the executive committee. Yes, Jennifer.
I nominate Aaron Betts.
Aaron Betts. And Aaron, do you accept?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Jennifer.
All right, thank you. And are there any other nominations for this position of public appointee on council to the executive committee? And I'll ask a third and final time. Are there any other nominations of public appointees to this position on the executive committee? Hearing no other nominations, I'll declare nominations closed, and Aaron Betts is a public appointee sitting on the executive committee for 2025. Congratulations, Aaron.
Thank you.
And the final position is another position on the executive committee for a public appointee to the Council of CDHO. And I'm looking for nominations to that position. Oh, Terry Strong.
I'd like to nominate Lori Binook.
Lori Binook. And Lori, are you willing to accept the nomination?
With all due respect, I will decline that nomination. I have had a wonderful time on the executive. I've just found myself, I've caught myself too busy with my real work, and that leaves me not enough time to do other things. So I'm gonna think maybe it's a good time to pass that role over to someone else. So, but thank you so much for the nomination, and I have truly appreciated my time there.
Well, thank you for all of the contributions that you've made up to this point, for sure. And we know that you're not going away, so we still know how to get in touch with you. So, all right, noting that, and with thanks, are there any other nominations for this remaining position on executive committee for a public appointee? Anne Marie.
I nominate Ella Diabanis.
Ella, do you accept?
It's a tough one because like Lori just said, the time commitment is what I want to make sure that I honor and not compromise, like not just say yes and not be able to show up, participate, and contribute to the fullest. So as much as I would like to say yes, that's a very long-winded answer that I'm providing. I'm going to respectfully have to decline just because I know what my other commitments are.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I think it's really useful to to really take stock of that before you commit to it. So I appreciate your honesty in that area. All right. I will ask again, are there any other nominations for the public appointee position on the executive committee? Jennifer.
I'd like to nominate Amit to the position.
Amit, are you willing to accept the nomination?
Yes, and thank you.
Oh, thank you. Okay, great. And are there any other nominations for this position? And I'll ask a third and final time, are there any other nominations for this position of public appointee to the executive committee? Hearing none, I'll declare nominations closed and congratulate Amit for his appointment or election to the executive committee. There's your slate. Congratulations to everyone. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to working with the entirety of council and of course the executive committee. We spend a little bit more time together than we do with the board or with the council as a whole, but definitely looking forward to all the great things we're going to do this year. Thank you. And I don't need a motion to destroy any ballots because we didn't have any elections. So I'll release the scrutineers and thank also Julie for her attendance. And I guess I'll turn it over to the chair now, Michelle, for the next item in the agenda, which is the council meeting evaluation.
Thanks, Glenn. I just wanted to say a quick thank you to council, and I just want to say that I look forward to working with all of you and also with Glenn and the CDHO staff in the coming year. I think there are a lot of really exciting things that we have on the go, and specifically, we're looking at creating that really solid strategic plan. Sorry, my dog is digging a hole in my carpet beside me. If you can hear rustling, that's what it is. Yes, so really looking forward to creating that strategic plan. And I know that will help council and Glenn and staff to continue to meet the mandate and mission of the college. And I think 2025 is going to be another great year of growth for the CDHO, and I'm really happy to be a part of it with all of you. So thanks again. I also wanted to just spend a couple of minutes because I didn't say anything at our last meeting, and I want to thank Terry for all of her work for the last 3 years as president. I saw firsthand all the time and energy she put into being president, and I just want to say thank you, and we all really, really appreciate it, Terry. And I know this is your last year on council, and you've been a very positive very positive person and helping with council. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
Okay, so we are near the end of our agenda for today. So item 6.
Glenn's waving, Michelle.
Oh, sorry. Pardon?
Glenn's waving.
Oh, Glenn,
I have my
sorry.
hand up. Sorry.
I can't see anyone.
Oh, can you not? Okay. I just wanted to echo your comments and really thank Terry for all the work and that we did together and the time that we spent together, because we do actually spend a fair amount of time together in the background talking about things. And it underscores to me how important it is to have a strong relationship, not just between the registrar and council, but specifically between the registrar and the chair of council as well. So I really appreciated all of we didn't always agree, but we usually always came to a resolution of some sorts. Right? So we're still smiling at each other.
Yeah.
But
Well,
thanks,
this
Terry.
I hope we still have the opportunity.
Yeah. Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah, no problem. So item number 6.1 is the council meeting evaluation. So I had meant to ask about this, but Veronica, I'm assuming that we will be sending a survey.
Where's Veronica?
We can, it's up to you.
Um,
In the meanwhile, Margaret, did you have your hand up? Was that a hand up?
She said
is
no.
that a no? Margaret, you're muted.
Not talking. No,
I don't know. There was a white. Oh, no, now it's on me. Maybe
Okay.
it just, never mind. Maybe it's just me.
Oh, she was clapping. That was
Oh,
her
clapping. Okay.
clapping icon.
All right. Never mind.
Okay, so council members can look for the evaluation form to be sent probably, I think, later today. And please fill that out. Our next meeting date is in March. That will be a hybrid meeting. So the council meeting is March 28th and our workshop is March 27th. So I believe Veronica will be sending out information for those that will be attending in Toronto as far as accommodations and travel information.
Right.
And that brings us to the end of our meeting. So I look forward to seeing everyone in March, and I will just have someone move for adjournment.
Margaret.
And again, I can't see anyone.
Margaret.
Amit, and seconder Margaret. All those in favor? Great. I'll just ask council or executive to hang around afterwards. We will be looking at some things, time-sensitive issues, executive at this point. So everyone else, thank you very much. Have a great weekend.